looking at the characteristics, traits, or early behaviors in early childhood and see how these affect later outcomes. As an economist, being always interested in labor market, of course, because these early characteristics determine many different outcomes from welfare to mental health to even the occupation that people choose later on in life. Then, of course, behavior, problematic behavior, or crime should be also considered. So a little bit of the motivation for this study. We know that juvenile offending is a big problem in the UK. It has been estimated around 17 billion of spending annually in late intervention. This basically covers mental health support, child protection, rehabilitation of young offenders. If you're familiar with the crime rate, they have been declining since the late 1990s. However, post-pandemic, youth crime has stalled, and we can observe now this crime is shifting towards more serious and violent offenses, especially at younger ages. And another problem that we can see in the data is the reoffending rates. Youth reoffending rates are larger than adult reoffending rates, and of course, this is a concerning from the perspective of the government that require some intervention. Now, the problem is quite clear. We know these young offenders are overrepresented in vulnerable populations. They come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, something that's quite difficult to target through policy. But we also know that these vulnerabilities translate into early behavioral problems and poor educational outcomes. And of course, there is more room to do something about it on those issues. But the key questions still remain open. So which traits matter the most? And when is the right time to intervene? In terms of the literature, of course, we have literature that study these early behaviors and the association with offending. But most of the studies available focus on antisocial traits, especially severe antisocial traits such as psychopathy or low self-control, especially in the psychological side of the literature. And most of them are measured in late adolescence when this become more pronounced. However, it has been shown that these behavioral problems can be traced back to early childhood. And we know even when these are quite subtle, they still can be extremely important predictors of later outcomes. Another we can see the problem is that most of the literature rely on cohort studies or surveys, because of course this provides a lot of information on behaviors. But at the same time, they face challenges in terms of small samples because of attrition issues, or because we know attrition at the end causes problems with representativeness in the population. At the same time, we have self-reported measures of crime. So in that sense, basically, administrative records give us the chance to explore this with actual records of criminology, and at the same time make inferences for the entire population. So what I'm doing in this study, I use de-identify Ministry of Justice and Department for Education linked data for 3 cohorts of kids. These are children that were born in 2002, 3, and 4. We identify early behaviors at age 4 and 5 by using the early year foundation stage profile. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that data set in the next slide. We link these early behaviors or these early characteristics to adolescent offending, and we are exploring different types of offending outcomes, including the type and the number of offenses. Then we examine the pathways through school outcomes, so basically all the school experiences, especially in the primary education, from school reception to the first time the child interacts with the criminal justice system. And of course, all this analysis is conducted within the Secure Research Service. Okay, a little bit more about the data. So we have the early year foundation stage profile. This is the original version that was available up to 2012. After 2012, this went through major changes, if you're familiar with this. The EYFSP provides hundreds of indicators of child development in different scales. For this analysis, I'm using those that were considered at the time as indicators of having a good level of development. This includes the personal, social, emotional development, communication, language, literacy, problem-solving, reasoning, and numeracy. So in total, it's around 45 indicators that I'm going to use for this study. But that being said, if you use all the indicators in the EYFSP, the conclusions will be exactly the same. Now, this is available only for 40% of pupils, at least for the cohorts that I'm including in this sample. And that's because back at the time, local authorities were not required to submit the full disaggregated data, but instead just a sample. You can find the full scores for the full population, but the disaggregated indicators, this 100 indicators that I mentioned, only for around 40% of the pupils. It has been improving, right? So for 2000, for children from the cohort 2002, we have around 38%. Then for the next year, it was around 40%. For the next 42, so perhaps you can find these indicators more populated in next years. Then we use data from the Police National Computer. Here, basically, we are gathering information from offenses, disposal types, ranks, adjudication codes to construct all the offending outcomes in the analysis. I do have information of the school and school pupil census. This is basically just to gather set of controls to to include in the offending regressions. And here we have information on socioeconomic backgrounds, such as, for example, eligibility for free school meals, or we have also index of poverty. We have also demographics, of course, information on ethnicity or the language spoken at home, and other characteristics like the number of siblings or birth order, things like that, right? So that's basically the controls we are going to use in every specification. And of course, geographical location. Now we know the local authority, we know the school that the child is attending. From the National Pupil Database, we also have the variables for the school outcomes. So this is basically 3 school outcomes I'm considering in this analysis. One is absences, exclusions, and the other is attainment. So the first 2, absences and exclusions, I consider these as behavioral outcomes in schools that should be more related to the non-cognitive aspect of development, while attainment will be more closely related to the cognitive aspect. So here's a little bit of the time frame of the analysis. So at age 4 and 5, which is the first time I observed these children, that's basically school reception, we have information on the EYFSP. And as I mentioned, we gather all the information that I'm going to use as controls in the specifications, which is basically demographics and socioeconomic status, geographical location. Then from age 5 to age 11, I construct the behavioral outcomes of a school, which is exclusions and absences. Exclusions is basically an binary indicator, whether the child has been ever excluded, either permanently or temporarily. And absences is composite of many different variables, including authorized and unauthorized absences, changes in establishment during primary school, which can be perceived as interruptions during the school experience. We have the number of sessions missed because of exclusions. And that's basically just an standardized score. And at age 11, as probably you know, children undertake the key stage 2 evaluations. This is also an standardized scores in maths and English. And from age 11 to age 17, any record of offending, right? So we have different type of offending outcomes, but the main one is just an indicator whether a child has ever been cautioned or convicted for an offense. Okay, so the methodology, how we measure early difficulties. So what I'm doing here is using something that's called exploratory structural equation modeling, and that's because of the structure of the EYFSP. The EYFSP was meant to capture general development, right, and provide support to children that need it. But it's not a psychometric tool, so it was not meant to capture different domains of behavior, cognitive or non-cognitive aspects of development, right? So we can't make any assumptions about the structure of the data. And since we don't have any theoretical structure, then what we do is basically inspect the data, right? In the first stage, we explore the data, we check how items or indicators group together naturally, which is something that's called exploratory factor analysis. So once we determine the different domains that we can draw from the data, then we do a confirmatory factor analysis, which is basically confirming the structure by testing the model. And then I obtain reliable scores that basically are used in the specifications, right, in the regression analysis. Of course, this identification of different domains and different characteristics from early development is more complex than I'm just described at the moment, but I don't want to go into too many technical details, but if you're interested in factorization analysis, I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this. What I want to do here is to show exactly how I'm taking advantage of the variation in the EYFSP. So here is just to give you an idea. We have 9 different scales in the EYFSP, and each one of them have 9 point levels scales, or you can see them as indicators in the EYFSP. This is basically what you're seeing here, is the difference in achievement for each one of these indicators in the EYFSP. And this is the difference between offenders and no offenders. So the structure is a bit complicated. So, for example, for the first 3 indicators, right, you can see there is not much variation in achievement between offenders and no offenders. So we don't use this because we don't have variation. And also because the first 3 indicators are ordinal. So children need to achieve 1 and 2 if they want to achieve 3. So there is an ordinal nature on these indicators. Indicator number 9 is an indicator, also is ordinal as well. So children need to achieve the first 8 indicators to achieve number 9. And the indicator number 9 is the highest level of achievement a child can reach. So this is basically less than 1% of the population, right? So it's children that work beyond expectations. And as you can see, again, there's not much variation in that one. So what I'm working with the EYFSP is basically exploiting this variation between indicator 4 and 8. So basically 5 indicators for these 9 scales, 45 indicators in total. Not just because we have a lot of variation here between offenders and non-offenders, also because these are non-hierarchical, right? So children, in theory, children are supposed to achieve any of these indicators in any order. So this can be seen as independent indicators of child development that we can use in the factorization process. So we found 2 key developmental difficulties from this factor analysis where children need extra support. So one is socio-emotional difficulties, which are characterized by poor emotional regulation, difficulties in forming relationships, and communicating effectively. The other is cognitive difficulties, which are challenges in language, literacy, problem-solving, reasoning, and numeracy. So you can see here the content of each one of these domains. So this is for the cognitive domain. And these are basically the indicators that log into this domain. We have very basic skills here, things like write simple regular words or recognizes numbers from 1 to 9. And then you can see the content for the social-emotional domain. Here we have indicators such as forms good relationships with others or works as part of a group. Something that really got my attention is these indicators of communication and thinking, which you would expect to have an intersection between cognitive and non-cognitive ability, or between cognitive and social-emotional ability. But you can see these are quite important indicators for the social-emotional domains. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article on the BBC on the investment that the Violence Reduction Unit is doing in London. They are investing around £3 million to improve the communication skills of children in primary schools, because they acknowledge that the lack of communication skills make children more likely to be excluded from school. And they, of course, acknowledge that exclusions are very damaging for many different school outcomes. And you're going to see that this indicator is critical to explain social-emotional, and the social-emotional domain actually has an important association also with offending. Here basically is a summary of all the study and the model that I proposed for the fellowship. So basically we have all the information of the AYFSP, all the indicators collapse into these two domains, cognitive and social-emotional difficulties. And of course, these affect offending directly, or they can affect offending through school outcomes, which are potential mediators in the pathway between early development and, of course, the first interaction with the criminal justice system. Now, not all these pathways, this is the original model, not all these pathways are significant. I can give you as a preview of the main results. Cognitive difficulties affect offending only through school outcomes, especially through attainment, while social-emotional difficulties have a direct effect on offending. Around 50% of the effect is direct. The other 50% is through school outcomes, especially through school exclusions. Okay, so I'm going to show now the main results. And I'm going to focus only on the direct effects. So basically, I'm including mediators and the covariates of interest in the regression and look at how these affect offending. And that's because it's easy to interpret these results and see how the addition of school outcomes affect the relationship between early development and offending. But a proper mediation analysis has been done in the paper that hopefully will be released soon. And again, because this is a very long paper and we basically explore many different outcomes, I'm going to focus only on those outcomes that have some relationship with the determination of offending. Okay, so we know that social-emotional difficulties are a major driver of school exclusions. Cognitive difficulties are strongly associated with attainment. Both school exclusions and attainment matter for offending, as probably you expect. School exclusions more than doubles the risk of offending. The baseline rate for offending is around 2%. So around 2% of children in the sample engage in offending at least once during adolescence. And school exclusions more than doubles that risk. Attainment, or key stage 2 performance, acts as a protective factor. So one standard deviation increase in attainment reduces offending by 0.4 percentage points, which is a very interesting effect. As I mentioned previously, we have different pathways into offending. For cognitive affects offending only through school outcomes, especially attainment. But social-emotional has a direct effect on offending, also affects offending indirectly through school exclusion. And here you can see the estimates. This is basically marginal effects of a logic regression, where the outcome of interest is whether the child has been cautioned or convicted for an offense in adolescence. And on the top box, you can see the developmental difficulties, both cognitive and social-emotional difficulties. And on the bottom box, you can see school outcomes, which are potential mediators in the pathway to offending. It includes absences and exclusions and attainment. So we start with a very simple model. The blue dots is basically just counted for developmental difficulties. You can see both are positive and significant. Then we introduce school outcomes sequentially. So first, we start with absences and exclusions, which are behavioral outcomes. And you can see there is a potential mediation effect here, and that can be seen by the reduction in the magnitude of the effect for the social-emotional domain, while the cognitive decreases, but is a very small decrease, right, compared to the social-emotional one. In the gray squares, we introduce attainment. And you can see cognitive is no longer significant once we introduce, once we condition this regression for attainment. But the cognitive, the social-emotional, remains positive and significant for offending. If you compare this with the original effects, around 50%, right? It's a bit more than 50%. So basically 50% of the effect is direct, while the other 50% is mediated by the school outcomes, especially by exclusions. But again, you can see that exclusions here has a very large magnitude compared to the developmental difficulties. So school exclusion seems to be the most consistent and the most strongest predictor of offending, and you're going to see that basically in every single outcome of offending we analyze in this paper. Another interesting finding is we find these non-linearities in the relationship between early developmental difficulties and offending. So that's basically saying that children with extreme difficulties, both cognitive and social-emotional difficulties, are actually less likely to engage in offending compared to those with moderate difficulties. And this is potentially explained by two mechanisms. So one is that severe difficulties can themselves limit offending. So think about a child with severe cognitive impairment, or perhaps a child with extreme withdrawal that don't participate in social groups. And as you know, offending in adolescents generally are committed in groups, like, for example, vandalism, right? So it could be that severe difficulties limit offending percent. Also, it could be the case that extreme difficulties often trigger early support because these are more obvious to be identified, right? So extreme difficulties may lead to early support through special education need and disability services, or perhaps through social care. So just to give you an idea on this point, here we can see some estimates for logic models. So in the first column, we have identification of special education needs during primary school. This is, children that enter a school reception without any support or identification, either special education needs or children in need. But in some point in primary school, they are granted the status of special education needs or social care. Right? So in the first column, you have this identification of special education needs on the developmental difficulties and the square terms, just to capture these extreme children with extreme difficulties. So you can see there is a positive association showing that this is basically the children with severe cognitive and social-emotional difficulties are more likely to be identified in some point in primary school. In the case of children in need, we can see that social-emotional difficulties is quite important. But look at the offending regression. We can see there is a negative effect of these extreme cases, right? So we have some kind of concave shape on the relationship between early developmental difficulties and offending. As I mentioned, this could be the case because, of course, children with severe cognitive and social-emotional difficulties receive early support, and that's what we can see this negative pattern with offending. Or it could be the case that just severe difficulties actually limit offending per se. So let's look at the regression for offending just to test this idea, or to have a little bit more of intuition information on this. So this is basically the same regression that we looked before. So it is whether cautioned or convicted for an offense as the outcome of interest. And the blue dots, basically the original model, once we control for school factors. So thus you can see that cognitive is no longer significant for offending, but socio-emotional remains positive and significant. Then we include the indicators for special education needs and for children in need, and also the interactions with developmental difficulties. So first of all, if you look at the indicators for special education needs and children in need, these are positive for offending. That's because these are capturing additional vulnerabilities that haven't been accounted for in the specification. But the interesting part is this negative effects. You can see children with cognitive and social-emotional difficulties that receive support through special education needs or through children in need. They are less likely to engage in offending compared to those with social-emotional difficulties that don't receive any type of support. In fact, the estimate is larger than the original version. So once we control, or we just make this, we exclude from the specification children that receive support. Those that don't receive support are more likely to engage in offending. Again, the cognitive, of course, is not significant once we control for school outcomes, because remember, cognitive affect offending only through attainment. Yeah, even though those coefficients are not shown in this plot, they are already included in this regression. Another interesting finding is that we found that social-emotional difficulties remain associated with the type of offenses, especially violent and property offenses, and also with the number of offenses committed during adolescence, of course. But again, exclusions stand out as the strongest and most consistent predictor for offending. So here you can see on the y-axis, basically, we have type of offenses on the top box, number of offenses on the bottom. Here basically are the outcomes of interest. And these are the covariates included in the regressions, of course, plus controls. You can see social-emotional explained violent offenses, property offenses, and also the number of offenses. Exclusions follows the same pattern, right? Because we know they are quite associated to each other. But again, right, the magnitude for school exclusions is quite larger compared to the rest of the covariates. While attainment acts as a protective factor, especially for less serious offenses such as property and summary offenses, and also for the number of offenses as well. So robustness checks, and I want to conclude with that. Of course, we are concerned about confounding factors in administrative data. We don't have all the variables we need to claim causal effects. I can tell you the results are consistent when we account for school differences. So by including school fixed effects, for example, results are exactly the same. In fact, social-emotional domain, the magnitude for the social-emotional domain is even larger under, a school fixed effects specification. Now, but still, we are concerned about other confounding factors, especially those related to family backgrounds, because we don't have things like, for example, parental involvement. We don't have much information about the first 5 years of children in administrative data. So what we do here is using an identifier we have available in the data, which basically is a proxy to identify siblings. If you remember, I was at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned I'm using 3 cohorts of children. So we can basically observe siblings that are 1 to 2 years apart and exploit this variation just to control for any family share environment. So this table basically shows this specification. This is offending on developmental difficulties, including sibling fixed effects. And of course, this is just a linear probability model because we have 40,000 groups of pair of scenes. But you can see still the positive effect of the socio-emotional on offending remains here, and it's quite significant as well. In the second column, I'm restricting the sample to only brothers, just boys, because of course boys and girls have a totally different baseline rate of offending. And you can see the estimate is much larger. Now in the third column, we control for school outcomes, including attainment, absenteeism, and exclusions. And of course, we need to be careful with that estimates, because we are forcing linear model in a non-linear specification. And it becomes very problematic, especially because the relationship between offending and exclusions is not linear. So exclusions, the coefficient for exclusions tends to be overestimated, while the other covariates estimates are underestimated, right? But still, you can see the positive and significant effect of socio-emotional domain on offending, which is quite striking. Okay, so for those that are interested in factorization analysis, we ran also different robustness checks, like running a bifactor model, just to respect the idea that the EYFSP was supposed to capture general development instead of distinct measures of cognitive and non-cognitive domains. So we basically captured this general factor of general development and let the cognitive and the social-emotional explain just the remaining variants. But we found basically very similar effects. We use different alternative scoring methods, such as multiple item response theory, if you're familiar with that, just because it could be the case, even in theory, the EYFSP is not ordinal. We can still understand that perhaps there is some level of order in the indicators in the EYFSP, right? So we try different alternative scoring methods. And finally, sample selection, because we work only with 40% of the population. That's the data that we have available. And we didn't find any problems of selection bias in the estimates, at least not in terms of the observables. Okay, to conclude, by examining how child development measured early in life explains offending in adolescents, socio-emotional difficulties are a key predictor of offending, even after accounting for school outcomes. While cognitive affects offending only through attainment, we found some non-linear effects, and that because it could be the case because severe difficulties limit offending per se, or because these lead to early support. We found that social-emotional difficulties explain the type and the number of offenses, especially for violent and property offenses. Social-emotional difficulties operate through individual specific mechanisms rather than shared circumstances, and that includes the school and family. And I want to finish with some policy implications. Different problems require different solutions, of course. Cognitive difficulties after school, so school-based supports would be ideal. Social-emotional requires additional support, especially family and community-based interventions. We found that school exclusions are very damaging as an important and as a critical pathway to offending, and that becomes more relevant than ever because restorative practices is an important topic at the moment, right? That provide kids with communication support as alternatives to exclusions that can actually interrupt the trajectory into offending. And I want to finish with the comprehensive assessments, which are critical for identifying early risks and targeting support. As I mentioned, I'm using the original version of the EYFSP that provides hundreds of indicators of early development. The new version, after 2012, have less, I think it's around 17 indicators, so perhaps it's not possible to do the same analysis with a new version of the EYFSP. At the time, the idea was to let teachers have a little bit more of time to spend in the teaching process and interact with children, which of course it has value. However, it could be the case that we are losing a lot of information that we require to prevent children from engaging in offending. Okay, so thank you for listening. This is my email in case you want to get in touch or you have questions. And yes, thank you for